Hello and welcome to CS264. This is lecture 10 and this is lesson 4. In this lesson we're going to continue talking about LINQ and XML, and in particular we're going to look at event programming. So LINQ to XML events allow you to be notified when an XML tree changes. So you can add events to any instant of any X element. And remember, X elements represent nodes, and they can contain other X elements, so you can create some kind of tree structure. An X element's event handler will then receive events for modification to it or any of its descendants. So for example, if you add an event handler to the root of the tree, all modifications to the tree would be handled from that event handler. So there's two kinds of events raised when you modify an XML tree. They are the changing event and a changed event. Okay? Changing occurs just before the X object or X element or any of its descendants is going to change. And changed event occurs when some X object has changed or any of its descendants have changed. So let's have a look at some examples. So we'll use the Microsoft examples for changed and changing. They're really good examples about how you use LINQ to XML and events. Now I'm including them here from the documentation and references, and I have them here so that they work and we can see that they work just fine. It's worthwhile. I mean, I'm not going to go into details in this short lesson on specific reasons or where you might want to do this, but they have some nice examples here. So you might create a tree and then you want to make changes to the tree and update other parts of the tree and so forth. And so I'm not going to write new code for this one, the one that's perfectly good for you. So I've summarized the key details from all the other documentation around the topic because it's spread around the Microsoft site, and I've included them all here. So I put the work into that rather than writing more code. So if you understand the notes that follow, then you should be able to use the reference documentation to discover much more about LINQ to XML as well. So first thing we look at is the changed example, and that example can be found here on the Microsoft site. So you start off and create an element, a root element, and that element contains two sub-elements, two nodes, a total and an item. And then for the total, then we create a reference to that element, and we create a reference to the items element. Okay, and so ultimately what we're going to do then is we're going to add an event handler for a change event. We can see change.add, so we can handle this add event, and we can look for a change.remove to see if something has been removed. So if an element has been added or an element has been removed to the tree, then we're able to handle that. So you can see how it works here. And here we have items, so we're going to set an item value to be item 1 at value 25, item 2 at a value 50, and so forth. And then we're going to write out the total of the value total. Okay, and I suppose what's happening here is that we can check and see here. So yeah, so we're adding an element, then we just add the element, and if we're adding some text, we're going to add the text. Okay, so that's okay. So we're essentially assigning a value to it. Okay, and the same if we're removing. Okay, so it's not too bad. So the event handlers use this variable with the class type XObjectChangeEvent args. Okay, it's pretty long with the script, but the purpose of the class anyway is to hold the argument that's passed to the event handler, and we saw event handlers before, when LINQ to XML raises events. So the class contains 4 fields: add, name, remove, and value, and we see examples of these here. So add, remove, value as well here. Okay, so it's not too bad. Okay, so when we've linked to XML raised one of these events, say add, name, remove, or value, it passes the instance returned by the properties an argument. Then we can check the type of the argument, as we've done up here. Checking the type here, we get the type. Okay, then we can determine the type of event that's been raised. And the class also contains the property object change, which can be used to determine the actual change type. So object change specifies the event type when an event is raised for an X object and it's an enumeration. So add is 0, name is 1, name is 2, remove is 1, and value is 3, and that tells you that, you know, some X object, you know, which is like an X element or those kind of ones, and it's been added to an X container, and an object has been or will be renamed, an object will be removed, and an object will be changed. So these are the various enumerations and description for those. So events are only raised when an XML tree is modified, not when it's constructed. So when we created elements in the tree in this part of the program here, we didn't get an event. It was only when we ultimately would change it that we start getting events. Okay. So if you add an event handler to an event before you can receive events, so it's not possible to add a reference to an X object if it doesn't exist as well. So you got to be careful with that. It's not possible to get a reference to an object before the XML tree is constructed either. So that during construction of the tree, you won't receive events. That's why. So care is required when modifying a tree with one of the events, because doing this might lead to unexpected results. So Microsoft actually provide a really good and succinct overview of XML tree modification by events here, show you how to do it actually, and then tell you it's a bad idea to do it, or you need to be careful to do it, of course. You know. So in the example, after your event handler has been defined, the X element set element value method is used to create and delete child elements. That was just here. Okay. So the first parameter is an XName object, and that specifies the name of the child element to change. And the second parameter is the value to assign to the child element. So if the child element is removed, if the value is null. Okay, so otherwise the value is converted to a string representation assigned to the value property, the child element, and that method raises events. Okay, so you can look at the code and think, isn't XName just a string here? You know, if you're thinking this up here, well, didn't I just send a string even though I said it was XName? Well, yes, that was a question I was asking myself. So XName provides an implicit conversion from string that allows you to create an XName. So XName refers to an XML name, and they include a namespace and a local name. So a fully qualified name then is the combination of the namespace and the local name. So here's a namespace, and here is an element. Okay, so it's a name plus the namespace. That's the value that's been assigned essentially. So you're able to get that fully qualified namespace if you need to worry about those. So that ultimately produces this. Otherwise, we would just get element without the XML namespace attribute here. Okay, so you can see loads more about XML to LINQ and namespaces. This document link here, and so that works just fine. So let's have a quick look at this running. Okay, and it's fine. So it changed. We got a changed event out when we added, removed, add, remove, and add, and we get a total, because what was happening is that with the event handler was responsible for updating the actual total of the items that were added in the list. So let me just go back. Let me go back to the code here, and might not be obvious, but here's what's happening with the values. So we're adding the event handler, you know, for adding a new element, then we're updating the total. That's where the add is coming from here, okay? And we're adding it here as well, okay? So it's that's why it's going on here, okay? And the same here, it's subtracting the total if we get a minus number. Okay. We can also look at what happens when something is changing. So it's an event that's called just before it changes. And it's much the same again, except this time we're actually adding a different event. Okay, so we're looking at creating a changing event. So here we're looking at the changing event. Okay, we're adding the changing event here, an event handler for each of these elements here, and we're looking at, and here we're adding a changed event. So you can have both changing and change events attached to an element, in this case the root element of the tree. So, you know, if we add something here and add a new element, then we can see there's a changing event raised, and it tells you who the sender was and what the change was, and then a changed event raised. So it shows that you can have changing. So it's almost like, you know, just before the event is actually happening, you can raise an event, the event happens, and then an event is raised. Okay, sorry, to say something has happened. Okay, so anyway, it's a bit tricky, but and it's probably a while since you looked at the event handling, and you really need to have it in context. But it's worthwhile having it here in case you ever need to do this. So small little bit of information about event handling using LINQ to XML, and we learned about changing and changed events. Thanks very much for watching.